Emma wiped the dust from her grandfather's old workbench as the clock on the wall struck 6. Another day was ending at her small watch repair shop on Oak Street, and once again no customers had walked through her door. The tiny shop felt empty and quiet, filled only with the gentle ticking of dozens of clocks and watches that lined the walls. She remembered when her grandfather ran this same shop 20 years ago. Back then people valued their timepieces. They would bring in their precious watches and clocks, trusting him to bring them back to life. Her grandfather had taught her everything he knew about the delicate art of watch repair. He showed her how to handle the tiny gears with steady hands, how to listen to the rhythm of each timepiece, and most importantly, how each watch carried a story. But times had changed. Now everyone carried phones in their pockets. Why pay someone to fix an old watch when you could simply look at your phone screen? Emma's business had been struggling for months. Some days she wondered if she should give up and find work elsewhere. The rent was getting harder to pay and her savings were running low. As Emma began turning off the lights and preparing to lock up for the evening, she heard the small bell above her door ring. A gust of cold winter air swept into the shop as an elderly man stepped inside. His name was Thomas, though she did not know this yet. He moved slowly, his shoulders bent with age and sorrow. His gray coat was thin and patched in several places, and his shoes were worn from many miles of walking. Despite his humble appearance, Thomas carried himself with a quiet dignity that Emma noticed immediately. His eyes, though tired and sad, held a gentleness that spoke of a man who had lived through both joy and great pain. In his weathered hands he clutched something wrapped in a faded cloth. "I'm sorry to bother you so late, miss," Thomas said in a soft voice. "I saw your light was still on, and I was hoping you might be able to help me." His hands trembled slightly as he unwrapped the cloth, revealing an old pocket watch. Emma stepped closer to examine it. The watch was clearly very old, probably from the 1960s. The gold case had lost its shine and turned a dull brown color. Deep scratches covered the surface, and when she held it to her ear, she heard nothing but silence. The watch hands had stopped at exactly 3:15. "This watch belonged to my son James," Thomas continued, his voice growing softer with each word. "He was a good boy, always helping others, always making his mother and me proud. He joined the army when he turned 18 because he wanted to serve his country." Thomas paused, and Emma could see tears forming in his eyes. She waited patiently, sensing that this story was important and painful for him to tell. "James carried this watch with him everywhere. It was a gift from his grandfather, my father, who also served in the military many years ago. James promised me he would keep it safe and bring it home when his service ended." Thomas's voice began to break. "But 3 years ago, on a Tuesday afternoon just like today, 2 officers came to my door. They told me James had died serving his country far from home." Emma felt her heart tighten as she listened to Thomas's story. She could imagine the terrible moment when he received that news, the way his world must have stopped. "The strangest thing happened that day," Thomas went on. "This watch, which had never stopped working in all the years James carried it, suddenly went silent. It stopped ticking at the exact moment those officers knocked on my door. It hasn't made a sound since that terrible day." Thomas looked down at the silent watch in Emma's hands. "I know I don't have much money to pay you. My pension is small, and I've been saving every penny I can. But this watch is all I have left of my boy. Sometimes I hold it and imagine I can still hear it ticking, just like when James used to call me and I could hear it in the background." Emma examined the watch more carefully. She could see that the damage was extensive. The main spring would need to be replaced, several tiny gears were missing, and the internal mechanism would require complete rebuilding. The parts alone would cost far more than Thomas could afford. Any reasonable repair shop would tell him it was impossible to fix. But as Emma looked into Thomas's hopeful eyes, she saw something that went beyond business. She saw a father's love, a grief that had lasted 3 years, and a desperate wish to feel connected to his lost son once more. She understood that this was not just about fixing a watch. This was about healing a broken heart and keeping precious memories alive. "I'll try my best, Mr. Thomas," Emma said gently, surprising herself with her promise. "Please leave it with me for a few weeks. I'll see what I can do." Thomas's face lit up with gratitude and hope. "Thank you, miss. Thank you so much." He carefully counted out some crumpled bills from his wallet and placed them on her counter. After Thomas left, Emma sat alone in her quiet shop, holding the silent watch. She could feel the weight of responsibility in her hands, knowing that she held much more than a broken timepiece. She held a father's love, a son's memory, and the hope that time could somehow heal even the deepest wounds. Emma arrived at her shop early the next morning, her mind focused entirely on Thomas's pocket watch. She made herself a cup of tea and cleared her workbench, arranging her tools in neat rows. The morning sunlight streamed through her small window as she carefully placed the silent watch under her magnifying lamp. What she discovered made her heart sink. The damage was far worse than she had first thought. The main spring, which was the heart of any mechanical watch, had snapped completely in two. Without it, the watch could never tick again. Several of the tiny brass gears that moved the hands were either cracked or missing entirely. The delicate balance wheel that kept perfect time was bent out of shape. Emma picked up her phone and began calling watch part suppliers across London. She started with the companies her grandfather had used for decades, hoping they might have the parts she needed in their old inventory. The first supplier listened patiently as Emma described the watch model and the parts she needed. After checking his computer for several minutes, he gave her disappointing news. "I'm sorry, love. That's a very rare watch from the 1960s. I haven't seen parts for that model in over 10 years. The second call went no better. The woman on the phone explained that military watches from that era were made in small numbers, making replacement parts extremely difficult to find. "You might try calling some antique watch dealers," she suggested. "But I warn you, if they have what you need, it won't be cheap." Emma's third call was to a specialist in London who dealt only in vintage military timepieces. When she described Thomas's watch, she heard excitement in the man's voice. "Ah yes, I know that model well," he said. "It was given to British soldiers during their service in the 1960s. Beautiful watches, very well made. I do have the parts you need." Emma felt hope rising in her chest. "That's wonderful. How much would they cost?" The answer hit her like cold water. "For everything you've described, you're looking at about £350. These parts are extremely rare, and I only have one set left." Emma thanked him and hung up the phone, her hands trembling slightly. £350 was more money than her shop made in 2 good months. She knew Thomas could never afford such a sum. When he had left the money on her counter the night before, she had counted only £20 in crumpled bills. That evening, Emma climbed the narrow stairs to her small apartment above the shop. She lived simply in 2 rooms that had once been storage space. Her furniture was old but comfortable, and the walls were decorated with photos of her grandfather and some of his finest watch repairs. As she prepared a simple dinner, Emma could not stop thinking about Thomas. She remembered the way his voice had broken when he spoke about his son James. She imagined him sitting alone in his own small flat, hoping and praying that his son's watch might tick again. She thought about James, a young man who had died far from home, serving his country with courage. Emma opened her laptop and began researching the watch's history. She learned that it was indeed a special edition, given only to soldiers who served in specific regiments. Each watch was engraved with the soldier's name and service number. These watches were built to last a lifetime, designed to keep perfect time even in the harsh conditions of military service. As she read more, Emma discovered that many families treasured these watches as precious heirlooms. Sons passed them to their own sons, creating chains of memory that connected generations. For Thomas, this watch was not just a timepiece. It was his last physical connection to James, a way to feel close to the son he had lost. Emma walked to her bedroom and opened the small wooden box where she kept her savings. The bills were neatly arranged, money she had been carefully setting aside for months. This was meant to pay next month's rent and buy groceries for the following weeks. Her shop had been struggling, and this small amount represented her only security. But as Emma counted the money, she thought about her grandfather's words. He had often told her that fixing watches was about more than earning money. "Emma," he used to say, "when we repair someone's watch, we're really repairing their memories. We're keeping their stories alive." Emma made a decision that surprised even herself. She would use her savings to buy the parts for Thomas's watch. It meant she would have to find another way to pay her rent, perhaps by asking her landlord for extra time. It meant eating simple meals for the next few weeks. But some things were more important than her own comfort. She called the London supplier and placed the order, giving him her credit card information with steady hands. The parts would arrive in 3 days and then the real work would begin. Late that night, Emma sat at her workbench with Thomas's watch in front of her. Under the warm glow of her desk lamp, she began making detailed notes about each damaged part. She sketched diagrams of how the gears should fit together and made lists of the tools she would need. As she worked, Emma felt her grandfather's presence in the quiet shop. She could almost hear his gentle voice encouraging her, reminding her that the most important repairs were the ones that healed hearts as well as timepieces. The watch lay silent before her, but Emma knew that soon, with patience and skill, she would bring it back to life. Emma spent the next 2 days preparing for the delicate work ahead. She cleaned her workbench thoroughly and arranged her smallest tools in perfect order. The morning light was best for detailed work, so she started each day at sunrise, when her hands were steadiest and her mind was clear. On Thursday morning she began the careful process of taking the watch apart completely. Using her finest tweezers she removed each damaged piece, placing them in small labeled containers. The work required absolute concentration. One wrong move could destroy a part that might be impossible to replace. As Emma worked deeper into the watch's mechanism, she noticed something unusual behind the watch face. There appeared to be a small piece of paper wedged in a space that should have been empty. Her heart began to beat faster as she realized this was not part of the original design. Using her most delicate tool, Emma carefully extracted the tiny piece of paper. It was yellowed with age and folded so small it was no bigger than her thumbnail. Her hands trembled as she slowly unfolded it on her workbench. The paper was fragile and she was afraid it might crumble at her touch. What she found written there in faded blue ink made her gasp. In neat, careful handwriting she read the words, "Dad, every tick of this watch means I'm thinking of you. When I come home we'll have all the time in the world. Love always, James." Emma had to stop working. Tears filled her eyes as she read the message again. This young soldier had hidden a love letter to his father inside his most precious possession. James had carried his father's love with him every day of his service, and now Emma understood why the watch had stopped when Thomas received the terrible news. It was as if James's love had been keeping time itself alive. She carefully placed the note in a safe place and continued her work with even greater purpose. This was no longer just a repair job. She was handling a sacred connection between a father and son, a bond that death itself could not break. Over the following days, Emma noticed Thomas walking past her shop every morning on his way to buy groceries at the small market down the street. He would slow his steps as he approached her window, and she could see him glancing hopefully at her door. But Thomas was too polite and respectful to interrupt her work by asking about progress. Emma wished she could tell him about the note she had found, but she wanted to surprise him when the watch was finished. She could imagine the joy on his face when he discovered his son's hidden message of love. Mrs. Wilson, who owned the flower shop next door, often stopped by to chat with Emma during her lunch breaks. She was a kind elderly woman who had known Thomas for many years. During one of their conversations, Mrs. Wilson shared something that made Emma's heart ache with sympathy. "That poor Thomas," Mrs. Wilson said, shaking her gray head sadly. "Every Sunday morning he walks to the cemetery with fresh flowers. He sits by James's grave for hours talking to that boy as if he were still alive. He tells him about his week, about the weather, about the neighbors. Sometimes I see him there when I visit my own husband's grave." Emma learned that Thomas had no other family. His wife Margaret had died 5 years before James, and his son had been his only child. Thomas lived alone in a small flat 3 blocks away, surviving on a modest pension. The watch repair was probably the most expensive thing he had attempted to buy in years. On Friday afternoon, a delivery truck stopped outside Emma's shop. The driver carried 2 small packages, both marked with the London supplier's return address. Emma's heart raced with excitement and nervousness as she signed for the packages. These tiny parts represented hope, the possibility of bringing Thomas's treasured watch back to life. In her workshop, Emma carefully opened the first package. Inside, nestled in soft foam, was the new mainspring. It was a perfect match for the original, made of the finest steel and coiled with precision. The second package contained the replacement gears, each one no bigger than her fingernail but crafted with incredible accuracy. Emma held each part up to the light, examining them carefully. These tiny pieces of metal and steel would soon become the beating heart of Thomas's watch. Each gear, each spring, each screw represented the possibility of giving him back his connection to James. She began the delicate process of rebuilding the watch mechanism. Working with steady hands and endless patience, she installed the new mainspring first. This was the most critical part, the component that would store energy and release it gradually to power the entire watch. Next came the gears, which had to be positioned with perfect precision. Emma used her magnifying glass to ensure each tooth aligned correctly with its neighboring gear. The slightest error would prevent the watch from keeping accurate time. As she worked, Emma felt the presence of both her grandfather and James guiding her hands. She understood that she was not just assembling metal parts. She was putting together a puzzle made of memories and love, creating something that would bring comfort to a grieving father. The work was slow and demanding, but Emma never felt frustrated. Each tiny piece she installed brought her closer to the moment when Thomas would hear his son's watch ticking again, closer to the joy she would see in his eyes when he discovered James's hidden message of eternal love. Emma
After
spent
3
the next
long
2
weeks
days
of patient
preparing
work,
for the delicate
Emma
work
sat at
ahead.
her workbench on
She
a
cleaned
quiet
her
Friday
workbench
morning,
thoroughly and
arranged her
restored
smallest
watch labels
tools
in
in
perfect
perfect
order.
its golden case
The morning
gleaming
light was
under her
best for
work lamp.
detailed work.
She had spent
started
countless
each
hours
day at
rebuilding
sunrise,
every tiny
when her
part,
hands were steadiest
adjusting
and her
each
mind
gear
was
with
perfect
clear
precision.
On Thursday
polishing
morning,
every
she began
surface
the
until
careful
it shone like
process
new.
of taking the watch
The moment
apart
had
completely.
finally arrived to test
Using
her
her
work.
finest tweezers,
Emma picked
she
up the
removed
watch with
each trembling
damaged
hand,
piece,
feeling
placing
the
the
weight
weight
of
of small
3
label
years of
containers
silence
and a
The
father's
work
broken
required
heart.
absolute
She grasped the
concentration.
small winding
One
crown
wrong
between
move
her
could
fingers
destroy
and
a
began
part
to
that might
turn
be
it slowly,
impossible to replace.
feeling the tension
As
build
Emma
in the new
worked deeper into
mainspring
the
she had
watch's
installed.
mechanism,
Emma
she
held the
noticed
watch
something
to her
unusual
ear and
behind the
listened.
watch face.
For several long
There
seconds,
appeared to be a
there was
small
nothing
piece of
but
paper
silence.
wedged in a space that
Her
should have
heart
been
sank
empty.
as doubt flooded
Her
her
heart
mind.
began to beat
Had
faster
she made a
as she
mistake
realized
somewhere?
this was not
Had
part
one
of
of
the
the gears
original
slipped out
design.
of place?
Using her
She
most
wound the
delicate
watch a
tool,
little more and
Emma
waited,
carefully
hardly
extracted
daring
the
to
tiny
breathe.
piece of paper.
Then, like magic,
It was
she heard
yellowed
it,
with age and
a soft,
folded so
gentle
small
tick.
it was no
Then
bigger than
another
her
thumbnail.
and another.
Her hands
The
trembled
beautiful
as she
rhythmic
slowly
sound that had
unfolded
been
another
missing for 3
workbench.
years was alive
The paper
again.
was fragile,
The
and
watch
she
was
afraid
breathing,
it might
its
crumble at her
mechanical heart
touch.
beating
What she
steadily
found
in her
written there
hands.
in faded blue
Emma's
ink made her
eyes filled
gasp.
with tears of
In
pure
neat,
joy.
careful
She had
handwriting,
done it.
she read the words,
After weeks of
"Dad,
worry and
every
careful
tick
work,
of this watch means I'm
James's watch
thinking
was
of you.
keeping time
When I
once
come
more.
home, we'll have all
She
the
looked
time
at the
in the
watch
world."
face and saw
Love
the hands
always,
moving
James.
smoothly around the
Emma
dial,
had to stop working,
marking each passing
Tears
second
filled her
with
eyes
precision.
as she read the message
She spent
again.
the rest of the morning
This young
making
soldier
final
had hidden a
adjustments.
love letter to his
Using
father
her finest
inside his
polishing
most precious
cloth,
possession.
she cleaned every
James
surface
had carried
of the
his
golden
father's
case
love
until
with
it
him
gleamed
every
like
day
the
of his
day it was
service.
first made.
And now Emma
She set the
understood why
time
the watch
carefully,
had stopped
making
when
sure
Thomas
it
received
matched
the
perfectly
terrible
with
news.
the clock on her
It
wall.
was as if
She
James's
tested
love
the
had been
winding
keeping time
mechanism
several
several
times.
times.
Listening
She
with
carefully placed the
satisfaction to
note
the
in a
strong,
safe
steady
place and
rhythm.
continued her work
But as
with even
afternoon
greater
turned to
purpose.
evening,
This
a
was no
different kind
longer
of
just a
worry
repair
began to
job.
creep into Emma's
She was
mind.
handling a sacred
What if something
connection
went
between
wrong?
a father and
What
son,
if the watch
a
stopped
bond
working
that
again
death
after a
itself
few
could not
hours or
break?
days?
Over the
parts
following
were
days,
old, even the
Emma
new
noticed
ones,
how
and
mechanical
mechanical
watches
past her
could be
shop
unpredictable.
every morning on his way
She
to buy
imagined
groceries
Thomas
at the
a small
small
market
market
down the street.
failed again after she returned
He
it
would
to him.
slow his steps
The
as he approached
disappointment
her
would be
window,
crushing.
and she could see
Emma
him
had never
glancing
felt such
hopefully at her
enormous
door.
responsibility
But Thomas
in her
was
work
too
before.
polite and respectful
This was not
to
just
interrupt
about
her work
fixing
by
a
asking
timepiece
for
for
a
a customer.
progress. This
Emma
was
wished
about
she
a
could tell
father's
him
love
about
for
the
his
note
lost
she had
son,
found, about
but she
keeping
wanted to
precious
surprise
memories
him when
alive,
the watch was
about
finished.
healing a heart
She
that
could
had been
imagine
broken
the joy
for
on
3
his
years.
face when he discovered
night,
his son's
Emma
hidden
could not
message of
sleep.
love.
She
Mrs.
lay in her
Wilson,
small
who
bed
owned the flower
upstairs,
shop next
listening
door,
to the sounds of
often
the
stopped
quiet
by to
street
chat with
outside
Emma
her
during
window.
her lunch breaks.
But her mind kept
She was a
returning to
kind
the shop
elderly
below,
woman who had
where
known
Thomas's
for
watch
many
sat
years.
ticking on her workbench.
During one of their conversations,
Finally,
Mrs.
Mrs. Wilson
Wilson
shared
shared
something
something
that
climbed
made
down the
Emma's
stairs
heart
to her
ache with
workshop.
sympathy.
Emma
That
turned
poor
on her
Thomas,
desk lamp and
Mrs.
sat
Wilson
in her
said,
grandfather's
shaking
old
her
chair,
gray head
the
sadly.
restored watch in
Every
her
Sunday
hands.
morning he
She
walks to
listened
the
to its
cemetery
gentle
with
tick,
fresh
tick, tick,
flowers,
a sound that
he
seemed
sits
to
by
fill
James's
the entire
grave
room
for
with
hours
warmth and
talking
life.
to that boy
The
as if he
rhythm
were
was
still
perfect,
alive.
steady and
He
strong,
tells him
just
about
as
his
it should
week,
be.
about the weather,
She thought about
neighbors.
Thomas, probably
Sometimes I
lying
see
awake
him
in
there
his
when I
small
visit
flat
my
just
own
a few
husband's
blocks
grave.
away.
Was
Was
he
he
staring
staring
at
at
the
Thomas had
ceiling,
no other
hoping
family,
and praying that
his
tomorrow
wife
would bring
Margaret
good
had
news?
died 5 years
Was he
before
remembering
James,
James as
and
a
his
little
son had
boy,
been his
or
only
thinking
child?
about all the
Thomas
conversations
lived
they would
alone
never
in a
have?
small flat
Emma
3
could
blocks
imagine
away,
him holding his
surviving
pillow
on a
close,
modest pension,
wishing he could hear
the
his
watch
son's
repair
voice
was
one more
probably the
time.
most expensive
Her
thing
thoughts
he had
turned to
attempted to
James,
buy in years.
the young soldier
On
who had
Friday
carried this watch
afternoon,
through his
a
military
delivery truck
service.
stopped
She
outside
pictured
Emma's
him in
shop.
uniform,
The
checking
driver
the time
carried 2
before an
small
important
packages,
mission,
both
feeling
marked
connected
with the
to
London
his father's
supplier's
return
precious
address.
gift.
She
Emma's
thought
heart
about the
raced
tiny
with
note he
excitement
had
and
hidden
nervousness
inside,
as she signed
the
for
message
the
of love
packages.
that had waited
These
3
tiny
years to be
parts
discovered.
represented hope.
As the hours
possibility
passed,
of bringing
Emma began
Thomas's
to
treasured
understand
watch
that this
back to
repair
life.
meant much more
In
than
her
fixing a
workshop,
broken
Emma
timepiece. carefully opened
She
the
was
first
helping to
package.
heal a broken heart,
Inside,
restore
nestled in
faith
soft
and goodness,
foam, was
and
the
prove
new
that love
mainspring.
could survive even
It was a
death
perfect
itself.
match for the
The
original,
ticking watch in
made
her
of
hands
the
was
finest
not just
steel
marking
and coiled
time.
with precision.
It was marking
The second package
continuation of a
contained the
bond between
replacement
father
gears,
and son that
each
would
one
never
no
truly
bigger
be
than her
broken.
fingernail but
Emma
crafted
realized
with
that her
incredible
grandfather
accuracy.
had been right all
Emma
along.
held each part
Fixing
up to the
watches
light,
was never just
examining
about
them
springs and
carefully.
gears and keeping
These tiny
accurate
pieces
time.
of metal
It
and
was about
steel would
keeping
soon
memories
become the
alive,
beating heart of
about helping
Thomas's
people
watch.
stay connected to
Each
the ones
gear,
they
each
loved,
spring,
about
each
preserving
screw
the stories
represented
that
the
made
possibility
life
of giving him back his
As
connection
dawn
to
began
James.
to light up the
She
sky
began the
outside her
delicate
shop
process
window.
of rebuilding
Emma
the
felt
watch
peace
mechanism.
settle over her.
Working
The
with
watch
steady
had been
hands
ticking
and endless
steadily for
patience,
over
she
12
installed
hours
the new
without
mainspring
stopping.
first.
She was
This
confident
was the
now
most
that her
critical
work was
part,
solid
the
and would
component
last.
that would store energy
Thomas
and
would have
release
his
it
son
gradually
back
to
in the
power
only
the
way
entire
that was still
watch.
possible.
Next came
Emma
the gears,
walked to
which
the
had to be
telephone on her
positioned with
counter
perfect
and dialed
precision.
the number Thomas
Emma
had
used
given
her
her.
magnifying
After
glass to
3
ensure
rings,
each
she
tooth
heard his
aligned
hopeful voice
correctly with
answer.
its neighboring gear.
Thomas, this is
The
Emma from
slightest
the
error
watch
would
shop,
prevent the
she
watch
said
from
gently.
keeping accurate time.
Your watch is ready.
As she worked,
There was a
Emma
long
felt
moment
the
of
presence
silence
of both
on the
her
other end of the
grandfather
line.
and James guiding
Then
her
she heard
hands.
Thomas whisper.
She understood
Thank
that she
you,
was
dear
not
girl.
just assembling
Thank
metal
you so
parts.
much.
She
I'll
was
be
putting
right
together
there.
a puzzle made
Emma
of
hung up
memories
the
and
phone
love,
and carefully
creating
placed the
something
ticking
that would
watch
bring
in a
comfort
soft
to a
cloth,
grieving father.
ready to return
The
a
work was
father's
slow
most
and
precious
demanding,
treasure.
but Emma never felt frustrated.
Each tiny piece she installed brought her closer to the moment when Thomas would hear his son's watch ticking again,
closer to the joy she would see in his eyes when he discovered James's hidden message of eternal love. Thomas arrived at Emma's shop at exactly 9 o'clock on Saturday morning. Through her window, Emma could see him standing outside, taking deep breaths and smoothing down his gray hair. He was wearing his best white shirt, though she noticed the collar was frayed and the sleeves were a bit too long for his thin arms. This was clearly the nicest clothing he owned, saved for the most important occasions. Emma opened the door with a warm smile. "Good morning, Thomas. Please come in." Thomas stepped into the shop carefully, his old shoes quiet on the wooden floor. His eyes immediately searched Emma's face, looking for any sign of good or bad news. Emma could see the hope and fear battling in his expression. "I have something for you," Emma said gently, reaching for the soft cloth where she had carefully wrapped the restored watch. Thomas's hands began to shake as Emma placed the beautifully polished timepiece in his weathered palms. The gold case gleamed in the morning sunlight streaming through the shop window. For a moment, Thomas just stared at the watch in amazement, hardly believing it looked so new and perfect. Then he heard it. The soft, steady tick-tick-tick that had been silent for 3 long years. The sound he had dreamed of hearing again, the sound that connected him to his beloved son James. Tears began streaming down Thomas's weathered face immediately. He lifted the watch to his ear with trembling hands, closed his eyes and whispered in a voice full of love and longing, "Hello again, my boy. I've missed you so much." Emma had to wipe away her own tears as she watched this reunion between a father and his memories. The joy on Thomas's face was pure and beautiful, the kind of happiness that comes from having something precious restored after believing it was lost forever. Thomas opened his eyes and looked at Emma with overwhelming gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you properly," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "How much do I owe you for this miracle?" Thomas reached into his jacket and pulled out his thin, worn wallet. Emma could see it contained only a few small bills, probably his grocery money for the week. "Just £20 for the basic cleaning," Emma replied firmly, though she knew the replacement parts alone had cost her more than 15 times that amount. Thomas looked confused and tried to protest. "But surely the parts, all your time and skill, this must have cost much more than £20. Please, let me pay you what this is really worth." Emma shook her head with a gentle smile. "The £20 you already gave me is perfect payment. Seeing the happiness on your face right now is worth more to me than any amount of money could ever be." Thomas tried several more times to insist on paying more, but Emma remained firm in her refusal. She could see that arguing was causing him distress, so she simply placed her hand over his and said, "This is my gift to you and to James's memory." Thomas carefully placed the ticking watch in his vest pocket, close to his heart, and left the shop with tears of joy still flowing down his cheeks. Emma watched him walk slowly down Oak Street, stopping every few steps to pull out the watch and listen to its beautiful sound. About an hour later, Emma heard her shop bell ring again. She looked up to see Thomas returning, this time carrying a small dark blue velvet box in his hands. He approached her counter with the same dignity he had shown before, despite his humble circumstances. "Emma," he said solemnly, "I want to give you something that belonged to my dear wife Margaret. She passed away 5 years ago, 2 years before we lost James." Thomas opened the velvet box to reveal a simple but elegant gold wedding ring, worn smooth by decades of love. "This was Margaret's wedding ring," Thomas continued, his voice filled with respect and love for his late wife's memory. "We were married for 42 wonderful years. She would have loved you for what you've done today. She always believed in helping others, especially when they were hurting." Emma started to protest, feeling that such a precious family heirloom was too valuable a gift. But Thomas gently interrupted her. "Please, you must take it," he insisted. "You didn't just fix a watch today, Emma. You gave me back my connection to my son. You made it possible for me to feel close to James again. Margaret would absolutely want you to have this ring. She believed that love should always be passed forward to good people who make the world better." Emma accepted the ring with tears in her eyes, understanding that refusing it would hurt Thomas deeply. She knew this was the most valuable thing he owned, and giving it to her was his way of expressing gratitude that words could never contain. Word spread quickly through their small neighborhood about Emma's incredible kindness and skill. Mrs. Wilson told her customers at the flower shop. The baker mentioned it to people buying their morning bread. Soon, people began bringing their own treasured timepieces to Emma's shop, along with the stories of why these watches and clocks meant so much to them. Emma's business began to thrive in a way it never had before. But more importantly, her shop became a place where people brought their memories, their grief, and their hope. She realized she was not just fixing mechanical objects, but helping to mend hearts and preserve love. Every Sunday morning, Thomas would walk past Emma's shop on his way to the cemetery to visit James's grave. The pocket watch would be ticking steadily in his vest pocket, keeping perfect time. He would wave at Emma through her window and smile, and she would wave back, both of them knowing that love never truly dies. Sometimes it just needs someone caring enough to help it tick again. The end.